We have an interesting evening ahead. We have a wonderful speaker in the name of Robin Rivet, and she's going to talk about pot blunders and correct a lot of things that we've been doing. But before we introduce Robin, I'd like to bring to your attention a few things that the chapter is doing. As you recall, we were supposed to have our green scene, but that didn't happen because of COVID. So we thought outside of the box and we developed the spreadsheet, and we ended up having an internet plant sale, which worked extremely well and broke all records as far as plant sales are concerned. We want to continue the tradition that we've had in the past, and we have the Great Scion Exchange Wood coming up, Great Scion Wood Exchange coming up in February, and we want to go ahead with that. I'm going to send a memo out to the board and hopefully present an idea where all of our members, and that includes CRFG members, can participate. And as we move forward in this program, we'll introduce what we're doing to everybody, and hopefully we get the input that we need, and we can go ahead and have another successful Scionwood exchange. So that's one of the first things that we've got. The other thing that I want to remind board members is that because of Thanksgiving and because of Christmas, we've had to change the dates of our November and December meetings. The November meeting has been pulled forward to Tuesday, 24th, and I will send out another reminder and a Zoom link, as well as the agenda, and also a draft memo for everyone's review before it goes to the general membership. The second thing is in December, we're going to put it back till after Christmas and before New Year, so it will be Tuesday, December 29th. But I will make sure that everybody's aware well beforehand. We know that some of you will have family activities and things that won't allow you to participate, but as long as we have a quorum, we'll be okay. And if there is a need to vote on anything, then we'll go ahead and vote and let everybody know what the decisions are afterwards. Let's see. I'm not sure who's online at the moment. If John's there, John, do you want to add anything relative to the Treasurer's report? Okay, I don't hear John. Martha, I know Martha was going to have some communication.
Oh, John?
Okay.
Yeah, they had me muted, so I couldn't speak.
Okay.
No, yeah, everything's just fine. We're doing great. So
okay, that's good. And Martha was having internet issues, so she might not be able to join us tonight. But from what I gathered from her, she's okay, and no issues from her side. So if there's nothing else that comes to mind at the moment, I'll move straight into our speaker. Welcome, Robin Rivet.
John.
And I'm sure she
John
will
McNeil.
give a riveting presentation. Oh, sorry. Holly, did you want to say
Laura,
something?
yes. Yes, I just wanted, as membership chair, I wanted to remind folks to go ahead and pay your dues. And we now do accept PayPal. So consider paying your dues. You can take a look at whether or not you want to pay your state dues separately from your $10 chapter dues. So, or pay them all together, and you can pay by, send a check in, and all the information is at ocfruit.com under join us. So please remember to pay your dues. Thank you.
Okay, good.
And John, I'll be happy to give a brief introduction to Robin,
Oh,
if that's
good.
okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
that'll be great.
Hi, Robin. Thank
Hi,
you so
John.
much for joining us. So Robin Rivet, she is a consulting horticulturist, designer, and garden writer, and self-described public policy wonk with a renaissance passion for melding science, art, and technology. She's won many different awards to do with various things from tree mapping projects that calculate ecosystem benefits of urban trees, many different projects within the community that are very remarkable, including her 25th year as a University of California Master Gardener, very long standing. And I first got connected with Robin through Margaret and Rob, some of our members that were just so excited to see her present at the Festival of Fruit. That was the one in Arcadia, is that correct? Was that last year? And so, yeah, just had such high reviews, and I had the opportunity to chat with Robin a couple weeks ago, and we're both arborists and have some common ground for sure. She's got a pretty impressive story as far as her own garden at home and her own fruit trees. Hopefully that kind of comes into the conversation in your presentation, at least a little bit, to get a peek. But yeah, we're excited to have her, and thank you so much for coming, Robin.
Thank you.
And feel free to take it away.
Okay. Well, first, thank you for inviting me tonight. I have to confess that I've given lots of presentations to various groups, including my own chapter. But I have to admit that doing a Zoom presentation is new for me. So I will do the best I can. I'm used to bringing a lot of stuff with me when I present. So I would normally have pieces of trees and buckets and lots of props. So instead, you're going to see lots of slides. And don't worry about taking notes, because generally I say something 2 or 3 times, so you finally kind of get it. So bear with me. And I know there will be questions, and I will be as patient as possible at the end. I believe whoever is moderating, perhaps you, John, if there's an urgent question and it really needs to come to my attention in the middle, you can interrupt and we could try to do that. But I would prefer, if possible, that we held questions off. I will be as patient as possible at the end and answer each and every question if I possibly can. And maybe you can answer some for me. That's how it works. So
I could also do a little bit of housekeeping, just because I did fail to mention some general Zoom stuff. So we do have a chat window that is available. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there should be a little button that says it says chat. It might be different on a cell phone, but this is looking from a laptop. You can type in a question. I would recommend just sending that to everyone in the meeting, and that'll be accessible to field later. If it is pertinent, like Robin said, we can maybe interject, but probably leaving everything towards the end. And let's see, Robin, we did discuss earlier that you would be okay with us sharing this, recording this and sharing it on our YouTube. That's correct?
right, that's correct.
Okay, great. So if anyone needs to re-reference that, that'll be along with our other meetings that we've posted to our Orange County CRFG channel on YouTube. And there's plenty of previous meetings, so you can feel free to check out there. I think that should take care of it. You can adjust where someone's there. I'm seeing currently on my screen multiple videos of different members here, including Robin and John and myself. You can adjust that to just show you can just show a single person if needed, and that way you can see more of the actual presentation screen. And so if you hover your mouse over the video screens, you'll see little single double or multiple thumbnails that'll basically pull up different people's videos. So you can kind of shrink it down to get more screen real estate. And it looks like we've got the YouTube channel posted in the chat box. So if you do want to reference our YouTube, you can click on that and that'll take you right to it. And I think that's it. Go for it, Robin.
Okay. Well, first I want to kind of dispel a couple of things. I came up with this title, Pot Blunders, partly because I've planted hundreds of trees, and over the years I started seeing the same problems over and over and over again. And eventually I came to realize that dealing with nursery quality was probably the #1 problem that can be corrected by people who are planting trees, growing trees, and maybe through no fault of their own, ending up with a failed tree. So that's why the title is Avoiding and Correcting Defective Tree Growth. So let's see, I need to be able to advance my slide, and for some reason,
Would either use sometimes the left, right arrows.
yeah, here we go. Well, okay, so when I gave this presentation in the LA area, unfortunately, some people thought that I was going to talk about a different kind of pot. So I just want to get that out of the way first, that I am talking about pots as in potted plants. We're not here tonight to talk about cannabis. That could be another whole conversation, but it's not what I'm going to be speaking about tonight. So if you tuned in to hear about that kind of pot blunder, I'm sorry, that won't be the topic for the evening. What I am going to talk about is the pots that you get your trees in most of the time. And in Southern California, virtually all trees, fruit trees, regular ornamental trees, are almost always sold in some type of a nursery pot. And that's not quite true for the rest of the country. So most of the country isn't quite aware of the problems that we have. And it's not the pot's fault. There's lots of different kinds of growing pots and they're trying to modify them. But in general, it's our fault that the plants continue to be poor. So I'm going to mention about kind of 9 or 10 things that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on. And the first one is just labeling problems. And that's usually avoidable, but it's a very common problem. Number 2 being girdled and kinked roots. If I can get everybody to get on board with that one, and you can forget everything else, you're going to come away a lot wiser. There's a lot of injuries that occur in the nursery and then after you get home to branches, bark, and grafts. Again, mostly avoidable if you know what to do and not to do. Lowest limbs get removed, and maybe you'll learn why that might not be such a wise idea. Staking damage, lack of trunk taper, rootstock taking over the scion. That's a big one for rare fruit growers. Doesn't happen too often in the nursery, but it can. The root crown buried too deep. I see this actually quite a lot, and you're going to learn a little bit about that. And then topping and heading cuts. Some people do it intentionally, so you need to know what the ramifications are. So let's start with ID of cultivars or rootstock. So here's a sample nursery plant. And in this case, this young girl here, she's looking at the big pot and she sees a good sized nursery tree. And the label down here, can you see my, my arrow?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So basically there's one of these printed labels on the pot itself. And it says it's a Hass avocado. However, there's a little wooden stake inside the pot, and this person looks at the wooden stake and says, oh, it says that's a magnolia. And I hate to say, but this happens a lot more often than people realize. And it's really bad if it says it's a Citrus caracara, but you get it home, it's actually a Meyer lemon. And you couldn't tell because it didn't have fruit on it when you bought it. And so you really have to know, carefully about what the labels are and confirm that the tree you're buying and taking home, because there's nothing worse than having 10 years go by and you finally start getting fruit and it's not what you were nurturing all these years. Girdled and kinked roots. You're going to hear a lot about this. So when I was growing up, this is basically what I was taught about a tree, that it kind of grew up above the ground, and there was this sort of mirror image underground of what the tree sort of did underground with the roots. And then later on, they kind of modified this idea so that you had sort of foliage and a trunk, and then there was still sort of a triangular thing of roots with a bunch of kind of tap roots, structural tap roots. And I have to tell you that neither one of these are what are accepted today. In fact, it's so different that this is actually what is considered more the arboriculture model for not just a couple of trees, but virtually all trees. In fact, arborists tend to say that 90% of tree roots grow in the top 3 feet of the soil, 70% will grow in the top 18 inches. And that is regardless of whether it's a giant eucalyptus or a small citrus tree. And so you have to keep this in mind when you're going to be planting your trees, and whether they come out of a small pot or a big pot, you want to be thinking about the fact that the roots are going to be spreading no matter what kind of a tree it is. So here is my partner in crime, and this is a picture in our backyard. And Steven Stuverud's a lifetime CRFG member. Some of you may know Steve. But he's holding up a loquat seedling that was, he planted from seed, and it's about 6 months old. And you can see that it's about maybe 7 or 8 inches tall at this point. But the root system on it is probably 18 inches long, 2 to 3 inches the size of the height, or 2 to 3 times the size of the height. So if this was in a 1 gallon pot, and you can see it's nice and light, and you could move these roots around. But if this was older, if he was going to transplant this right now, it probably would fit into a 5 gallon pot, which I believe he put it in. But then what? What happens when it gets to be 4 feet tall? Where are all the roots? And they're going to start moving around and around. So you have to learn about that and think about that potted plants just can't sit around too long. This is a nice, healthy plant. And frankly, this is the way you should plant most of your trees. So here's an example of a small rooted plant. And you can see that the liner has the roots growing back up into the liner, up from the bottom up. And then 7 months later, this is what you're going to expect to see, that these roots that go all the way up to the top, they have nowhere to go, and they're going to start going round and round. The bad part about that is that if you let it keep going, eventually it has the risk of killing the tree entirely. So you don't want that. And you have to stop it before it gets to this point, which means you really have to stop it in the nursery. Now, this is much more typical of what you see. A lot of people buy their trees in maybe 5 gallon, 15 gallon containers, and they pull them out, and the root ball is kind of firm. On the outside, you may see some fibrous roots. You may see a couple of thicker roots along the side. If you're smart, you probably get in there with a knife and you kind of score it up and you cut it up a little bit. But what a lot of arborists are now realizing is that's not good enough. And if you don't do anything, you end up with this. And in 5 years, this turned into this. So then you have to look out for damage to branches, bark, or graft. And this again is things you might see in a nursery pot. A lot of times in nurseries, they put the pots very close together. So in order to accommodate that, they remove all the lower limbs because the pots are very close together. So this cut is pretty good. This cut, I can't really tell, but this cut is cut way too close. And what happens when you put a flush cut on a branch is that you really are creating a wound, and any kind of decay can actually go from the cut into the main trunk, and it may not die right away, but eventually that wound could cause a problem. Same with this, maybe a good graft, it might have been fine, but it's starting to go bad. You're getting necrosis and you're getting splitting, and this is a case where it might fail. So if you see these things, you want to avoid picking them up. Here's 2 more cases of things to look for when you're looking at your nursery plants. When they're constricted like this, this is probably from where it was staked and tied and the tree tried to grow. Eventually the stake got moved, but it continued to grow. But in this case, you've got a double leader. So actually one of these leaders should have been removed and made more dominant. Eventually, if this tree continues to grow, you're going to find that you have a likelihood of splitting in here. Insect and pest damage come in there. And again, you could be putting a lot of investment into this tree and then only to have it fail down the road. So here's a challenge, and this is kind of a trick question because I'm not going to tell you the answer right off, but basically here's like what looks like maybe a 15-gallon tree, and it's just like a pencil in a pot, no foliage at all. My question really is, would you buy this tree? And on the other hand, here's another tree, bigger caliper, lots of good foliage on it. You know, it's got a sign on it, so it's obviously being sold in a nursery. So just think about these 2 pictures because I'm going to come back to this pictures later. Would you buy the one that doesn't have any foliage, that's just a whip in a pot? Or would you buy the one here that's thicker and heavier with nice, good green foliage on it? A lot of times the root collar gets buried under the soil. So this happens a lot for people who buy trees bare root. It can also happen in a pot itself. But if you buy bare root trees, you often will see they're actually grown in the ground, and then they're dug up and bare rooted basically and sold to you in a dormant stage. And a lot of people don't know how to plant a bare root tree. How deep should I plant it? And most times you're told to go look at where the soil line was. And in this case, the soil line was way up here. And that's not where you want to replant it at home. You want to replant it below the graft. Here's the graft, and here's the flare. Here's where the trunk swells and then your root tissue. So you actually want to plant this at the grade of your soil, or an inch or 2, an inch above or an inch below the soil grade, no more. I hate to even talk about staking, but it's a serious problem in the nursery, and it's even more serious for people when they get home. These are just ugly images, and I know most of you probably have seen damage from staking, but for those of you who have purchased trees with a central nursery stake on them, gotten it home and planted it and left that nursery stake on, it's a very, very bad idea. So I believe nurseries should actually be forced to take them off before they sell them to you. But in any case, no stake should be on a tree for longer than maybe 6 months. Trunk taper is what happens when you have a tree and the caliper down low is thicker than up on top. So your leader should narrow as it grows. When it's tied to a stake like over here, basically this is good. When it's tied to a stake, it doesn't sway in the wind and it won't get strong. And so as that stake gets removed, it starts to tip over. I like to tell people that they should remove the stakes when they're in the nursery and see if the tree tips over. But actually, you can usually tell how flimsy it is just from looking at it and if it has taper or not. And if you do get it home and it does fall, then you should get those stakes off immediately and stake it properly if necessary, and then take them off as soon as possible. This is probably unique to rare fruit growers. You probably see this a lot, and hopefully you don't buy trees that look like this, but sometimes I've seen this happen in garden sales and even occasionally in a nursery where the rootstock may have taken over the tree. And or sometimes it simply happens at home from sloppy pruning or damage or one thing or another, and somebody buys a house and the tree is mangled and it doesn't seem to have the fruit that's supposed to taste so good on it anymore, and that's because the rootstock took over. But if you see a nursery tree where it looks like this, just avoid it. It looks to me like the rootstock has taken over. There's a few other things to think about with bringing your tree home, or what happens in the nursery. Pruning done at the wrong time of the year, heading cuts that are made that haven't been corrected, topping and the resulting poor branch structure. So this is a picture from Agriculture and Natural Resources in California. I'm sure you've seen similar things like this before, but this is assuming you're going to buy a bigger tree, which I don't recommend, but they show the tree starting out with the same trunk, the same initial branches, and then what a good way to have moved the tree along to getting good structure, and what happens if somebody just tops it. And you can see what goes on. And I'm going to repeat this several times, but by the end of tonight, you're going to see the differences, hopefully, in what makes a very good tree and what makes a very poor tree architecturally. So we have these problems, but why do nurseries not sell you perfect stuff? And I'm going to say it's complicated. This is the standards. They're put together. They do get revised. The American standards for the nursery stock are a national standard. They were updated in 2014. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that all nurseries follow them. Or maybe they try to, but they just don't have the resources to get everything right. And the other problem is that there's a lot of nuance. It's very technical, and most of it talks about how thick the trunk is supposed to be, the caliber, how tall it's supposed to be, how big the pot is supposed to be. It gets very, very technical. The problem, in my opinion, is that it doesn't actually guarantee you that you're going to have a healthier quality tree. It just tells you how big it's supposed to be in the big size pot and the big size trunk. And it has not resulted out here in Southern California, where the vast majority of our trees are grown in nurseries that look vaguely like this. And quite frankly, I wouldn't buy any of these trees. So it's just, again, to me, this standard needs to be very revised for containerized trees, and they need to look below the soil grade. And they're not doing it enough. Now, in fairness, there is another tree standard, and this is put out pretty much by arborists, and this has been updated. These are also ANSI standards, and here's an example of 10 of the parts of the tree standards that the tree care industry puts together. And there is a root management standard. And interestingly enough, I have a copy. It's pretty good. It's much better than the other standards. My objection is that unlike those horticultural standards, which you can find online and download, these are not actually made available to the public. If you want a copy of this, you have to go online and you have to pay this company to get a copy of it. And I find that offensive, because it basically means your municipalities, all the people who really need to know these standards, are not practicing them, and they're not using them. And I make the analogy to buying a car. You know, you wouldn't buy a car without the proper standards. Why buy a tree that way? Trees live longer than cars. So it's really important that we start out with good health with our trees. Another problem is old books. This is a sample from Linda Chalker Scott. She writes a tree blog. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but Dr. Scott is a professor at the University of Washington. She has a great tree blog, and she loves to bust horticultural myths. And so I kind of borrowed this from her. But this is a page from a book, and if you read everything it says here, it tells you to prune the top of the tree to offset the loss of the roots. Well, that's bunk. It tells you to wrap the trunk with burlap, drive a stake 2 feet in the ground, and you can see it's tied up. It tells you to use hose and wire. Well, you should not do that. It tells you to put some nice loose soil on top. And then it tells you to create a ridge to hold water so that there's water sitting and wetting the trunk. No, you don't want to do that. It tells you to add special good soil in there around the root ball. Put in a layer of manure and a layer of stone for drainage, and then break up the subsoil. Every single thing it's telling you to do here is wrong. So if you have a book that's 40 years old or more on trees, throw it away. Now here's a picture I robbed from a big box store that was actually selling this plum tree and telling you this is what it looks like. And so I had a look at it, and I pointed out to myself some things that I thought might be wrong with it, even though this is what they were promoting as a good plum tree. And there's certainly some things good about it. So this is another slide where I want you to kind of look at it for a second, but we're going to come back to it. And I'm going to tell you what I think. But anyway, so here you go. I'm going to give you a little hint, because you see this dark space right here, and you see this leader coming up, and there's like 7 or 8 branches coming. I assume this is a heading cut. And when you make a cut on a plant, it tends to make a lot of other little branches. And so there's no real reason to do that with a young tree except to make it sort of look prettier. It's actually harmful to the tree. So what happens when you cut a tree? This is, again, something I don't think people understand well enough. Trees really don't heal. Any kind of a wound, whether it's breakage or somebody intentionally pruning a tree, the idea that a tree heals is simply something that we think about because we tend to heal. But we tend to heal from the outside in, and trees tend to heal from the inside out, and it's a very different process. And so when a tree gets a wound, a big cut like this, it doesn't really, it may seal, but it doesn't heal. And I'm going to show you an interesting analogy. But keep in mind one of those old books you might have laying around that tells you to put everything from tar to concrete to ceiling paints into these wound holes is, again, very poor advice. Research has been done now that at best they don't do anything, and at worst they do actually do harm. So if you make cuts, the only time you may want to apply any kind of paint onto a tree would be if you have a tropical tree that has been overly pruned or is very sparse and it may get sunburn. You can use a 50% latex white paint or light colored paint that just helps protect the tree from sunburn. It's not protecting the wounds, and it won't protect your wounds. So here's a little, this is a topic that I could spend a whole hour talking about, and I'm not going to do that. But this is essentially what arborists talk about when they talk about decay in trees. And they've come up with this idea of what they call CODIT, or compartmentalization of decay in trees. And essentially the idea is that when a wound enters a tree and decay starts to set in, the tree will try to launch a defense by essentially using chemical barriers within the tree's biology to thwart the decay from spreading into the tree. So they've actually made a model with 1, 2, 3, and 4 different parts of the tree wood that push back to try to thwart this decay from spreading. And so it will start trying to reduce the decay from going vertically and down into the trunk, and it will try to stop it from spreading radially and into the heartwood. And so there are different types of chemicals. And again, it's really very complicated, but I want to mention it because a lot of people think that as long as you can't see the wound anymore, that it's gone. And that's not true. Any wound that happens to a tree, you can cut it out 50 years later and you can still see evidence of it. So I'm going to make this analogy, and I hope it's a little amusing for you. So those of you that ever saw The Wizard of Oz, and I know most people have seen it, which is why I use it, but try to imagine that you're Dorothy and you've got your crew there and you're caught in the witch's castle and you're trying to run away. And everywhere you run, you turn and you run down one alley and the gate's shut. So you turn around and you run the other way. And so basically that was the idea behind this. So this slide, the idea is that decay comes in and a wall comes from one side, a wall comes from another, it pushes back against that decay. So that's the idea behind it. Anyway, that was my little fun thing. So I've kind of mentioned now sort of the things you want to look at, and also basically what kind of organizations are out there to sort of steer things better, but aren't really working. So as a consumer, what can you do? So I know I'm guilty, and that's why I can make slides like this, but have you ever walked through a nursery tempted to look for the largest tree in the smallest pot at the cheapest price? And I know I have. In fact, I did it, and that was the first tree I ever killed. And it's a temptation, you think you're getting a bargain. Wow, look at the size of that tree, and it's only, $15.95, that's why people buy queen palms. So the fact is that you're going to fail by buying the largest tree in the smaller pot because it's going to have kinked roots. I would recommend that instead you look at the different types of pots that you can buy trees in, and I'd look for the tallest one or the widest one, and then look for the smallest plant you can find. And that's the one you want to bring home. It's going to grow 2 or 3 times as fast as those big trees anyway. And labeling isn't just about the label, it's also about what you're looking for in the label. So for fruit buyers, if at all possible, taste the fruit from the cultivar that you want to buy. And don't rely on someone telling you it's the best thing you can ever get. You're the one who's going to end up with it. You should know, and you should be making that choice. If you go to a garden club sale, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Most of us do. I'm a rare fruit grower too, and I certainly have bought plants at garden clubs. I've also been the recipient of some plants that I wish I hadn't bought because either they weren't what they said they were, or they weren't healthy, or maybe there was questionable soil and I brought home bad soil. In any case, just buyer beware and know what you're looking for ahead of time. If you're a plant person like me, it's easy to go to the store and buy something that you just think is great, and then you get home and you don't know where you're going to put it. So don't guess. When you're in a store, a lot of stores will sell things that won't grow where you live. And that leads me to buy from local or regional nurseries. That isn't always possible, and there's lots of weird reasons why not. I know Steve and I were trying to find some Asian pears to plant, and we had decided we wanted the Dasui Li and Shin Li Asian pears, which were developed at UC Davis. And we thought they would be more acclimated for Southern California, down here where we are in the San Diego area. And I couldn't find them in California at all. So we ended up finding the plants we wanted, but we had to go out of state. So again, when you can do it, look local, and look for those tags that are tied on, not just stuck in a pot. It's all too common for somebody to come by, pick up a marker out of a plant and read it and then put it back inside the wrong plant. And then if it's a seedling or not, you know, you may think that something is grafted. There are some nurseries that are guilty of this, and we actually bought a loquat tree, and we assumed it was an air layer tree, and therefore it was a clone, and it turned out to be a seedling. Now, it turned out to be a good one, but you know, I would have liked to have known that when I bought it that it was a seedling. So these are things that, you know, buyers needs to know. And dwarfs. Again, most of you rare fruit growers, I'm sure, pretty much are aware of all the different kinds of rootstock. Some nurseries are better than others at telling you what kind of rootstock plants are planted on. But if you're just buying something from some friend and they tell you it's a dwarf this or that, unfortunately, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a client and they've told me, I don't understand why my tree is 20 feet tall. I thought I bought a dwarf. And I told him, well, actually, if it wasn't a dwarf, you know, it would have been like 40 feet tall. So a 50% dwarfing rootstock for a tree that might normally be 40 feet might still get to 20 feet. So again, these are things that you really want to know your rootstocks as well as what's up on top. And again, we come back to don't just look for the fruit, look at the roots. And this happens to be a picture of a nectar plum. I had to show it because I know you guys all appreciate fruit, and it's one of my favorite fruits. It's also a highly ornamental tree. And I'll just show you the picture before we look at the ugly stuff. So again, here's a picture of a really typical potted tree that you yank out of the pot, and you can see there's lots of girdling going on, lots of roots showing. But if you couldn't see these and all you saw were this fibrous roots around the outside, in this particular case, this was cut away on the right. And so if I couldn't see all this inside growth, I probably would have thought this was a good plant. But the way it is, I don't think this is rescuable. You can't cut enough of this away for this to be healthy. So this would be a case of a tree that I would simply say is not worthy of being purchased. So again, this is acceptable. This is not. And this is a pretty young tree. So, and it's unfortunately all too common. And especially when you're looking at rare fruit, sometimes you don't have a lot of choices. And so, you know, it's pretty important that you don't compromise yourself and buy a tree that's really unsatisfactory. So what do you do? Now, this is where it gets controversial, but I'm going to give you a lot of information about it. So wherever possible, buy bare root. But you may find that if it's an evergreen tree that they simply don't sell them bare root, or it only is a big plant. You have no choice about buying a bigger plant. And this is what I'm going to recommend to you, that before planting it, that you essentially take it out and you wash it. In this case, I'm not sure I would want to keep this plant, but that's a different story. And that includes evergreens, washing off almost all the soil to inspect it, trim any roots you can that were kinked upward facing. And finally, if it's really bad and you just don't think you're gonna do more harm than good and you can't possibly plant it, pack it back up into the pot and bring it back to the nursery and complain, because these sorts of things are supposed to not happen in the nursery. And yet I see them happen in probably 90% of the time once you get to a certain size container, like a 15 or bigger. And for those of you who are now gasping after listening to me, this does mean for subtropicals as well. That includes things like avocados. And if you have an avocado seedling, well, of course, you can probably plant the seed and graft onto it. You're smart, you're way ahead of the game, and you'll probably be fine. But other than tiny seedlings, you really should be probably getting the soil medium off of the pots before you plant your trees. Now here's a study that was done at the UC on almonds, and they had trees in pots and they didn't cut the roots away, and they planted these 2 trees here, and in 8 months they were dead. So it gives you sort of some pause, I hope, to look at this. These 2 were taken out of small pots, and then they looked at this one and they said, nah, you know, these roots are growing up, and it's probably, this one's probably not going to make it either. And so eventually, if you look closely, this is this tree. And so this is the only successful one that was actually able to be grown. These other 3 were essentially deemed not worthy trees. And this is only less than 5 months old. So if this is what's happening in test settings and research settings, imagine about the thousands and thousands of nursery trees that don't get this research, and people taking all the soil off and planting them and evaluating them instead of, you know, because here you can see all the damage, but if this was surrounded by soil, you might not have known how bad that was. So really the key is, when you get a plant like this, you have to take not only the outward roots off, but you take the soil off. You get it down so it almost looks like this, from this to this. And for those of you who are probably thinking, oh my gosh, you know, this is going to cause real harm and the tree's going to go into shock, I can't lie to you and tell you that that won't happen. But what I can tell you is that this is sort of the time where you would rather see your tree fail than to put it in the ground like this, and then 7 to 10 years later, find that your tree declines and then dies. And I have to tell you, as a consulting horticulturalist and arborist, when I go to people's homes and they ask me what's wrong with their tree, I would guess 80 to 90% of the time, it is a poor root architecture, poor planting techniques, and bad nursery quality. But there's hope. There really is hope. So if this same specimen is cleaned up and put into a pot, that's not good enough, because then it gets put into another pot that's bigger. And if these rigid downward sloping roots aren't corrected, then what happens is it spreads out, and then you get concentric circles growing in a pot. So now you have 2 clusters of girdled roots, and the outside ones are going to hide what's going on in the inside. And this is very typical. So when you see the outside of a fibrous root ball, you may not even be seeing this inner side that's really, really in bad shape. Now, nurseries should be doing this, but unfortunately, there's really no way you can see it at the nursery. And so the nurseries aren't really doing anything with it, and you get it home. And if you don't know what you're hearing from me tonight, you're none the wiser either. On the other hand, if you take it apart and you have this same beginning plant, and you get the soil off and you spread the roots around and you plant those into a pot, a bigger pot, and it grows out nicely, it makes more roots. Now, that's not the end all, but you could plant this out in the ground now. And if you wanted to pot it in a bigger pot, you would have to clip all these extra roots that are growing around the side before you put it in a larger pot. But at least this one is ready to go in a good shape. Now, if you wait, and now you have a nice big tree, and you got big roots that are going round and round, this is where the money comes in. So this is what arborists often get called to do. And if somebody's wealthy enough, they want you to excavate it. So you can bring in what's called an air spade, and it basically blows the soil out. And you can get in there and try to hand prune. But I can tell you that this is much more risky to the tree. It's very expensive. And really, it's much harder to rectify by the time a tree gets mature. So avoid it. Avoid it when it's a small tree. It's really easy to do, and it will reestablish. So I'm going to reiterate this, but I want you to realize that I'm not the only crazy person that's telling you to do this. I mentioned Linda Chalker-Scott to you. She is the professor at the University of Washington. She has a really wonderful blog, and she's also a very accomplished author. She published this article in Fine Gardening magazine on why and how to wash roots. And Steve Aiken, the photographer, gave me permission to use his photographs for this presentation tonight. And so he's going to go through here and show you a series of pictures on exactly how the procedure might work. Before I show you those pictures, I just want to cite the magazine. If you're not familiar with it, Fine Gardening, it's an East Coast publication, but it's actually a national distribution. And here's the article, and you can actually go to issue 191, and you can either subscribe to the magazine or you can get a quick peek for free. You know, like a lot of websites, it allows you to look just briefly, and then if you have to open the website too many times, they want you to subscribe. But this article is available to read. Again, it's a very nice magazine, and if you're not familiar, has a lot of interesting things in it. So here's the series of pictures, and typical small tree, you take it out. Now, this particular tree doesn't look like it has bad roots. This would be the kind of thing you might see probably in a quality nursery. And you might be tempted to just take it out and just pull away at some of these surface roots there and do what I call plant and pray. But instead, put it in a wheelbarrow, put some water in, work in the shade, and then start wetting down that root ball. So you're going to soak it till it's good and wet, and you're going to start to see that the roots will start surfacing. And you're going to kind of pull it out more and more, try to get almost all that soil media and whatever else is in there off the roots as much as possible. And eventually you'll see that there's a whole series of much thicker roots that are going all which ways inside. And this is the time where you're going to be pruning out anything that's going kinked, angled, going in the wrong direction, anything that has the possibility to strangle the trunk eventually. And you almost need to be ruthless. So feel free to please go read the article and contact Linda Chalker-Scott. I think you'll find her interesting, and her ideas are not unique to her anymore. This has been research that's been done for quite a long time. It just hasn't quite hit the mainstream yet, and so you're hearing it tonight. So what else should you look for? Well, back to those pots again. So here's a case where if you look at the trunk, it's maybe a little bit thinner here than it is down at the bottom. And you ideally should see some surface roots right at the top of the soil level. And again, I saw that on that bare root tree a couple of slides back. But in a pot, it's very typical for trees that sit in a nursery too long that the tree will actually start using up the organic material that's in the pot. And so nurseries will come around and basically the tree will sink, and then they'll add more topsoil into the pot, potting soil into the top of the pot, and eventually they will be burying that root flare, and that cause a type of collar rot if it's continued to be moistened and buried underneath where the top of the root zone should be. So essentially, you know, this is a good thing. And if you can dig down an inch or two, a couple of inches in the soil and still not see roots, then it's buried too deep. So when you get home, you want to plant your tree lower, and preferably you don't even buy a tree that's been buried too long in the nursery. So I had to show you this because this is actually me planting a tree maybe about 10 years ago. And this is before I knew about the idea of soil washing. But I certainly knew at that time about the problem with tree roots being a problem. And so you can see here I am, and I've got help, and I'm literally getting in there with a knife and trying to gouge out the tree and expose the tree roots before we plant it. And I want you to make a note here. So this is a 15-gallon tree, and there's a square hole. So we'll get to that later. And the soil from the hole that was dug is sitting here in these buckets. So it's going to go back into the hole. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when you get that pot home. Again, this is a sort of an overview, but there tends to be still the old-fashioned idea that you should dig a great big deep hole. And we're actually, if you remember that original few slides about how wide tree roots spread and that they don't go down very deep, you don't need to dig a very deep hole. You should look at your pot. Ideally, the soil level should be where the roots start. So you find that on the outside of your pot, and then you basically measure it, and that's how deep your hole should be. So you just kind of measure it there and then measure it here and start digging. Now, why a square hole? Well, it doesn't have to be perfectly square. The idea is that if there is really tough native soil and it's very hard and firm, and your tree roots start to get up and hit the wall of a round hole, a lot of times those tree roots, it might as well be in a pot, because if you're in a clay area and it hits that side of the clay where you haven't loosened the soil, it may just go round and round around inside the hole you've dug. And you don't want that to happen. So if you dig a square hole, when it gets to the corner and it turns, it's much more liable to penetrate your native soil by digging a slightly square hole. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, just have some edges, some places where it's not nice and circular. It's a lot easier to dig it this way too. And while we're on the subject of tree planting and getting that tree out of the pot, I get asked this a lot, what's your favorite fertilizer to put in the tree hole? Should I use worm compost or a special topsoil, or how much topsoil should I mix, or what should I do? And this is very, very difficult for some people to accept, but the answer is none of it. And it's very hard, I think, especially for fruit growers, because you really want this to be something you're going to eat. And so you associate growing fruit trees with like growing vegetables. And I grow vegetables, and we do add a lot of compost to the soil, but those are annuals. And we're at the end of the year, the soil is going to rest, and then we add more compost for next year. But a tree is not going to stay where you plant it. So if you imagine something like this, and this is from a blog where someone's telling you to plant plants in these pots in the ground. Well, if you imagine that planting with the native soil, if you put your potting soil into a hole, essentially it's going to sit there and you're going to get the girdled roots. This would be okay to plant herbs, but you certainly wouldn't want to plant trees like this. Now, this is another real tree guru. This is Dr. Ed Gilman. He's out of the University of Florida. And of course, Florida is a great place for fruit growing, and he's very appreciative of that as well. But he has an example of himself looking at a rather spindly looking tree and making remarks about it and saying, well, all the branches were removed, hardly any leaves on top. He doesn't think this is going to develop into a good tree. And his conclusion is, don't purchase a liner that looks anything like this. So, clue, what should you look for? Well, remember that old book? Well, this is the new book. You want a nice strong leader, no stakes, nice healthy bark, no mechanical injuries, lots of good spacing between the branches, good taper, good angles, some low branches left on. So this is the ideal situation if you are looking for a tree. And if you're looking for a small potted tree, don't forget you're liable to not even keep any of those branches on by the time the tree gets to be 20 feet tall. So you shouldn't even worry about it. Maybe that whip would have been okay. So what do I recommend? Well, I guess I'd say that the best thing you should all do is go bare root whenever possible. So for trees that go dormant, seek out the bare root trees. We have a pecan tree that we planted bare root, and it was about 3 foot tall. We retrained a leader, and it's probably 20 feet tall now in less than 10 years. And it's a beautiful tree. It did require a little training, and it's now just productive, and we get bowls full of delicious pecans. If I had planted it from a big box like this, I suspect it wouldn't even be alive today. I don't even recommend that you buy box trees. If you do need to stake and you get a tree like this with this whip and it starts to grow, there's no reason that your stake actually has to go into the ground. I thought this was a very unique picture that you can brace and keep a tree erect without actually having to keep it in the ground. So it's just sort of one more way of training a new leader on a whip. So here's some images on what to look for and what not to look for. This is something you see all the time, and you may have been told you get home, you cut the top off the tree. Well, it's not, doesn't end there. So if you cut the top off the tree, this is liable to be what you get, 4 new limbs. And you really want to start training them right away. So if you got this, you have to take off most of these limbs. So this is much better, but not all trees need a central leader. This is going to work for certain tropicals. For stone fruit, maybe you're going to have to adjust it. You can retrain a leader, but you've got to be conscious of what you're doing. So again, heading and retraining is okay, but you can't just head it back and leave it. So look at the difference. Nice radial spacing on this one. Here, all the limbs are coming out from the same space. Even if that's natural for the tree, you kind of want to retrain it at home. And something that I kind of learned about in the last decade is using limb spreaders. So rather than make so many cuts, we've found that using limb spreaders, whether you just use a stick that you've kind of made notches into, or we found some from Fedco Seeds, I believe it is. I left the link up here. They sell some metal ones that are reusable. They have little tiny little pricks at the end, and you can put them into your tree trunk, and they really don't do any damage, but they stay in place, and then they can be reused. It's a great way to train a tree without doing a lot of wounding. Now here's something nurseries are supposed to pay attention to, and I see often that they don't. But when you have a central leader, all the side branches should be preferably like at least half the size, no more than 5/8 of the size of the bigger trunk. So when you see 2 leaders coming out of the same place and they're the same size, then you want to avoid picking that specimen. And then again, this is an ANSI standard, but unfortunately, it's just too often neglected, I think, by the volume that goes through many nurseries. And here's that included bark again. So here's a case where, of course, you got staking on the tree, which I don't approve of. This tree should have had a stake removed a long time ago. But when you see this kind of a seam like that, there's basically bark from this branch and bark from this branch inside there. And that's just not a good thing to see. So you really want to get rid of that as much as possible. Where this kind of a visual, that's good. That's actually okay. That doesn't mean that's harmed. It's got the proper angle, even though with this stake here, I would probably be avoiding it. And since we're on staking again, the Arboricultural Society has actually put this image together saying staking is not usually necessary, usually not necessary. So in an ideal world, if you buy those 5-gallon or less size trees, you shouldn't really need stakes. So I deal with municipalities a lot, and you know, they have trees that cost a fortune, and then they dig enormous holes that need 5 people to plant them. Then they have 10-foot stakes, and it makes the cost of planting one tree in like maybe $2,000, and it's kind of a shame. So I really recommend that you get away from it. And when you see all this kind of mangled stuff from staking, just to go home and look at any plants you have that are staked and make sure that you're not doing more harm than good. And if you don't come away with anything else tonight, have a good look at these two images. This is from Dr. Ed Gilman again from the University of Florida. And it's kind of subtle maybe, but over time, hopefully you will be able to look at a tree silhouette and see the very distinct difference between a good quality tree right here and what happens here. And this is where probably this tree on the right was headed back and all the limbs are coming from one source. And here it's nice and variable. And if you go down your street, I hazard a guess that you will see 70 to 90% of the trees look more like the poor quality one than the good one. So this goes for not just fruit trees, but all trees. And if you really want a nice, healthy, long-lived tree, you really want to avoid this problem there. So remember that tree from the big box store? Well, the secret's out. So this was my observation from their picture. And if they really wanted to sell a tree, they should have found a better picture, because an arborist took one look at it and said, well, there was a couple of heading cuts here that were unnecessary and probably wrong. It's been staked too tight to a central nursery stake. This tree is so young, it shouldn't need a stake. The trunk lacks taper. It's very skinny from here all the way up. It's about the same size. You couldn't see any root color visible, so it was probably buried too deeply. And in a pot this small, with this big of a tree, it's very guaranteed to be root bound. So I see this being sold in a pot and I think, no, just go buy the potted plum as a bare root. Don't buy it in a pot. And remember those three images. Well, not three, I only showed you two the first time. So which ones would you choose? Well, my take is the one on the far left actually is the poor one. It's nice and green, but hiding behind this little tag on telling you what it is, I think it's probably an apple or maybe a plum, it was probably topped. All the lower limbs were removed. It's too thick a caliper to be in this size pot. So many things, and I can almost guarantee again that this would be terribly root bound. Again, stone fruit, buy it bare root. Don't even think about buying a tree like that. This one, well, this is better. Buying a tree in a whip like this, sometimes jacarandas, when they're dormant, might look like this when they're just under a year old. They may not put on side branches right away. Doesn't make it a bad tree. So this tree has promise. It might be very young and just grew really fast straight up. Hard to say. And obviously, this one's in the ground, but it looks like it doesn't have a stake. It's standing on its own. It's got nice foliage that seems to be kind of up and down the tree equal. And so this is maybe what you're looking for. So all this said, I guess really the big question is, all right, so probably you've heard a lot of other things and you do a lot of other things. And am I telling you that they're all bad? No. You know, Tom Spellman loves to talk about planting 3 in 1 hole or multi-grafted trees and how that saves space in residential yards. And he's standing in between 3 of them. And isn't that great? Well, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm simply recommending that it isn't the ideal situation. And a lot of people get into that idea and then they're not prepared to do all the maintenance that's necessary. And one tree is liable to be much more vigorous than another. And it's a lot more hard to manage. And you will find that one tree or one branch may take over another, but go for it. Just make sure that you understand what you're up against. Same thing with this lemon. It's a very small container. It's already got fruit on it. Clearly, it's probably been topped up here with new growth. I wouldn't buy this tree, but you might have luck. I spoke with John on the phone before I came on tonight, and he said he was hoping maybe I was going to talk about growing plants in pots permanently. Well, I don't recommend that. But if you don't have any space, well, there are miniature plants, and they've been designed to try to make fruit in small spaces. If you have the space, I highly recommend you put your trees in the ground and start them small. But there's no harm in trying to do this. The Chinese civilization kept trees alive in pots for hundreds of years. But what did they do? They took them out of the pot, they pruned the roots, they put in new soil. How many people do that? It takes a lot of work to do it right. So one last thought. A lot of you, I know, are interested in rare fruit. So my question is, do you graft? Do you air layer? Do you seek out rare cuttings or plants? Probably a lot of you. So I want to mention something you may not think about, and it's called phenotype plasticity. And basically, it's the idea that if you compare us plants to humans, every human is unique. We have parents, we have siblings, we may have children. We're all uniquely different. And when you have a cutting or an air layer, or plants are grown from tissue culture, or they're grafted, basically it is a clone. And so my question is, are clones beneficial for a sustainable ecology? And so really, why is this going to matter in our future? And it's kind of a complicated question, because I don't think in the short term it's a noticeable thing, but it's something I think we all need to think about for the future of growing fruit, growing plants, constant cloning. Many of us have a cultivated plant that has a cultivar name. So when you buy a particular type of apple tree or orange tree, there was a mother plant, and it's been cloned and cloned and cloned and cloned. And I would make the analogy to making a photocopy of a document, and you put it in your scanner and you scan it, and then you take that print and then you put it in a scanner and you scan it again. And by the time you do that 100 times or 1,000 times, you're going to see some deterioration. And basically that's the physical stuff. Well, what happens with plants, plant material, is that there will be some genetic defects, which actually could be positive. But on the other hand, there is what's called plasticity, which really makes the difference between a seedling and a grafted plant is that a seedling is going to be stronger. It's going to, over time, have some positive characteristics that are better for the environment, better for adapting to future climate changes over time. It may not matter in your lifetime, but it may matter in the big scheme of things, that we at least consider what's going to happen to the plant palette, over time. So it's something to think about. There's no real right or wrong answer. And by the way, I have to mention this. What is the best food to feed a tree? Well, I say the best food for a tree is another tree. So never be afraid of wood chips. I get asked a lot about eucalyptus wood chips or palm chips. And actually the research has been done, and eucalyptus and palm chips are actually the two best chips to put around all your fruit trees, or any tree as far as that goes. So coarse to reasonably fine down to maybe 1/2 inch shred is 4 inch deep around all your plants. Feed the soil, you'll get nice healthy trees. And if you want them to live for 100 years, so what are you going to do? You're going to check the ID, buy the smallest plants, choose your rootstocks wisely, trim all those circling roots and kinked roots, wash off that potting soil off those large specimens, dig your planting hole wide but shallow, Don't put amendments into your planting soil. Use limb spreaders instead of pruning whenever you can. Make sure you train your branches only after the first year of growth. Don't let water mill around a trunk. Let the wind blow your tree, so get those stakes off as soon as possible or don't use them at all. Expose that root collar, so don't bury it too deep, and add mulch. And hopefully your tree will thrive for 100 years too. So I've given you a bunch of internet resources and just want to thank you for being able to present tonight. Here is the website for Linda Chalker Scott. The Urban Tree Foundation has some great information on nursery specifications. Here's Dr. Ed Gilman from the University of Florida, has a lot of the resources I referred to. If you don't already have it, this book on home orchard tree care has a lot of fantastic information for backyard orchards, home growing. And here is one online that has a lot of great resources. And then here is the International Society of Arboriculture publications that are available for the public to download. And here's how you can get a hold of me if you want to. So here's my email. And I do ask if you contact me by phone that please just text me, because I don't tend to answer my telephone. So thank you. And I'm willing to now listen to all the weeps and cries about how it's crazy to take all the soil off your plants.
Well, Robin, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. It was an absolute eye-opener. I tell you, I just can't believe how much I've done wrong with my own backyard. And we've got a few questions that have come up. And what I'd like to do with Robert's help, or if Ty is still there, is to introduce the person that fielded the question and then let them ask the question of you, if that's okay. And I started the ball rolling, I think, since I've got a lot of pots and the trees are in what I call bloody big pots. I have to now roll them over and try and take them out and do some bonsai work on the roots, I guess, in order to keep them alive and keep them growing. Is that your suggestion?
I'm sorry, I was.
I've got trees in big pots, and
and you're thinking about trying to manage them. Well, again, my talk tonight was not really about trying to grow trees in pots. It was trying to deal with the trees that have been growing in pots already. But like I mentioned, that you can keep a tree alive in a pot, but you do need to be aware of the constricting problem, and that your tree will never be as vigorous in a pot as it will in the ground, for various reasons. But I understand why it may need to happen in some cases. Some trees are much more capable of being grown in a pot. I mean, a dwarf lemon might do okay. I would never think about growing a peach tree in a pot, except possibly a miniature peach. Is it worth your while to take out your tree and prune the roots and then replace the soil? I would say in some cases, yes. And in some cases, if it's been there a long time, you would probably do more harm than good. So, people the art of bonsai is really about keeping trees constantly monitored so they can live in tiny containers. So it's certainly possible to do, but people that do that, they know that is both an art and a science, and it requires a lot of diligence. I would assume that you probably may even know more than I do about growing trees in pots. I have some assorted trees in pots for various reasons, usually because I'm only using them for screening or decoration. I have an olive tree in a pot. And I keep saying someday I'm going to plant it out in the soil, but I haven't, probably because I don't think I'm ever going to actually harvest the olives and cure them and go through all the process. But you know, I would say it depends. You know, if you have a fairly young tree in a pot, it might be worth training it over time and removing the soil, and just like you would basically if you were repotting a series of containers like I described. So you kind of make believe that you're a nursery and you keep upping the pot. Now, if it's already in as big a pot as you can find, you know, you can go in and actually cut around the sides and try to encourage some new root growth. And I wouldn't do it all at once in your case. You could slice maybe one root and let it start to make new root tissue. And then next year, slice another root. And so gradually you're creating healthy new root tissue that will absorb water easier. But my guess is that it's going to get harder and harder to irrigate your potted plants to the point that it'll be all root and no soil.
Okay, I understand. We've had a few questions from a lot of people. Margaret Framers has asked a question. Margaret, are you unmuted? Would you like to ask your question of Robin?
Yes, I was wondering if you have a tree that's leaning, should the tree be staked to correct the lean?
Well, that depends. I would say it would depend on whether, first of all, how old the tree is. There's several reasons why trees lean. Unfortunately, one of the main reasons trees lean is that the roots were never established properly. And so you have large masses of roots that are still basically in the form they were in when they were planted. I could give an example where there was a storm here in San Diego that took down, probably at least a dozen mature Torrey pines. And they literally fell, you know, almost completely down to the ground. And these were, you know, at least 40, 50-foot trees. And what you could see is that the roots were clearly exposed. The whole root ball fell out of the ground and it was still square in the shape of the box that it was planted in. So, you know, this was a case where, first of all, Torrey pines should never have been planted in like 60-inch box trees. And they were planted near a golf course where it was highly irrigated. And so they sank, they were buried too deep. They basically were like having a pot inside the ground. And so, you know, sometimes trees will grow one-sided because they don't get enough light on one side, and you'll get a big limb that leans toward the sun. And that can sometimes cause a lean. Some leans can be very dangerous and could cause a tree to tip over. On the other hand, some trees, like there's one of the araucarias, or the trees that's very similar to the Norfolk Island pine. There's one called a cook pine, and they're the very tall, they look like a pine tree, but they're not. And they typically are always leaning. And that's just like their predisposition. It's perfectly normal. I get calls on that one a lot. My tree's going to fall down. It's leaning. And I come out to look and go, oh, well, that's okay. That's a cook pine. It's supposed to do that. So, you know, I think I would have to know more to answer your question. And some trees compensate. So if you get a lean, but then a branch starts growing vertical off of where it's leaning, and if it self-corrects, that's no problem. If it's a very small tree and it's really leaning badly, I would suspect poor roots. And all the staking in the world probably is not going to solve that. I mean, but it's always okay to break the rules. And so that's what you have rules for, is so that you know you're breaking them. So you'd have to have somebody actually, you know, Margaret, just send me a picture. Send me an email and send me a picture of the tree, and I can probably help you better.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Charlie Schaaf has an interesting question. Charlie, are you able to talk?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yep.
John and I have been creating air layers off of my very delicious lychee tree. We've been following the video that Roger Meyer did. The first step works beautifully. We can get them bagged, we can strip the bark, and we get roots. But step 2 of getting this thing in a pot and getting it to survive is virtually impossible because those roots want to flick off with like the touch of a feather. What advice can you give us?
Yes, we've encountered that a little bit. We've had the good fortune to have Quang Ong down here, who's a friend of ours who runs Ong Nursery. Some of you may have been to that nursery or ordered things from them. They acquire a lot of plants from Southeast Asia and obviously a lot of fruiting plants. And we had a longan tree that grew very successfully here in La Mesa. And in fact, we got it from Quang and it grew so successfully that he wanted to come back and take some air layers of it. And in exchange for doing that on our parcel, he offered to give us some free trees. So we had quite a barter system going, and he would come in and air layer the base of the tree and take off some branches. And so we eventually followed suit and had some success getting them to root. But I understand what you're talking about, that it does take a while because those are not structural roots. Those are very fibrous roots. So they will take quite a bit of time, even though you see the root tissue. That's probably a case where you really do need to repot it. And you probably need to prop it up a bit because you're essentially not getting a meristem. And this gets into sort of the cellular level of trees, where a tree grown naturally from the seed upwards to make branches and a trunk, it grows slower for a reason. So you're artificially creating a new trunk, and it basically is not, the tissue is not meristematic tissue. It's not the tissue that makes the leader. It's the side branch tissue. And it has a different, at the cellular level, it's different. And so it will just take longer. I mean, when you say you're having problems, my guess is that you're just probably not allowing it to have enough time in a pot to get stronger roots. I don't know what size branch you're actually air layering. Can you?
At the size of your pinky.
Okay.
Diameter.
Well, that's actually pretty small. I mean, the ones that Quang was air layering were a good, I would guess a good inch in some cases. So, were they semi-hardwood or were they hardwood?
John,
Kind
you
of
might.
at the end of the branches, Charlie, wouldn't you say? The biggest problem was trying to undo the plastic without breaking the roots.
Oh, I see. So you weren't having trouble getting it. So you didn't, or your question is how do you get it off the tree successfully, not how do you keep it alive afterwards?
Yeah, getting it into the pot. Like I say, those roots are so fragile that the slightest amount of torque would just break them off clean.
Right. Well, again, you're talking about an unnatural situation. So there's no plant information. There's no specific guideline on this that would come from, put it this way, I can't tell you the science behind it. I can tell you the practice just from having done it. And I would say twofold is that if you're using a very fragile limb, you're going to have a very fragile root. And so the longer you leave it in situ, so, you know, that's going to help. The bigger the limb you use, and the further down on the tree, That's also helpful. So if you're going to do air layering, my sources tell me that you're going to have more success if you choose limbs that are closer to the root ball.
That makes
So
sense.
that may help. And lychees can be, in my experience, a little fussy anyway. So I don't know how healthy your tree is to start with, and does it have a good system, and is it a vigorous tree? And so they're all factors. But I do know the longans. Steve has air layered successfully quite a few longans. In fact, Steve, are you on the call still? Maybe not. Anyway, you know, I know he had pretty good luck with taking out those, but I know they were fairly large efforts. So
Tell them to leave it a bit longer.
yeah,
Tell them to leave
well,
it
Steve's
longer.
right here. He says that he would leave them a little bit longer, and that's my
Tell
hunch
them
as
to
well.
root for a little longer in the air layer.
Yeah, leave it in the
Well,
air layer longer.
We have some that are about 2 years old now, so that may be long enough. Quick question.
On the tree?
Yes, on the tree.
Wow.
Steve, do you have a page tangerine in your backyard?
Yes.
Jim Neitzel gave a tour to Jim Crawford and me a couple years ago, and our last stop was at your house, and you let me pick up a number of page tangerines, fruits, and I have since planted a tree. My favorite tangerine so far.
Oh, well, okay. Well, that's great. Yeah, well, that's one of our favorites. And come February, March, that's a weekly juicing effort.
I believe it. Well, I'm glad to see you guys again.
Yeah. We move on with some more questions. Kathy Connell has one. Kathy, are you able to speak?
Can't see.
Yes, I can.
Okay, Kathy, go ahead.
My question has to do with a sweet cherry tree. I have one tree in the ground. I have plenty of room for it. I don't need to prune it at all, technically. But everything I read said, cut it down until it's only a couple feet off the ground. And I haven't done it yet. Now's the time. What do you say?
Well, I mean, first of all, sweet cherries are a dicey lot anyway. I mean, basically, there's only 3 cherries that you can successfully grow in Southern California, unless you're living out in Julian in the really cold inland areas. If you're in most of Orange County, to my knowledge, you're not going to get cold enough for anything other than the mini royal, the Royal Lee, and the new Royal Crimson, or what, Red Crimson, whatever.
That's what I have.
So you have which one?
I have a mini Lee and a Royal Lee.
A Royal Lee and a mini Royal. Yeah. Okay. And so
yeah.
You're wondering, and do you have the Z dwarf rootstock?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't know.
Okay, well, now actually my recollection is, because we did have some of those myself, and we had them on the standard rootstock, which is how they were first put out, and that's normally what they do when they come out with a new cultivar, is they put it on standard rootstock because it's more vigorous. They did put the mini Royal and Royal Lee, I believe, on Maxima 14, which has been the new dwarfing rootstock for cherries. And I think it's been successful, but the idea of taking it down more, I'm really not quite sure why you would want to do that. Is this a new bare root tree, or?
No, looks like we've lost her.
Unmute, Kathy.
Yeah, I don't know. She must have dropped off.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether she was thinking that it might have been the vase shape that was, open the center of the tree to let the light in and let it breathe and all that stuff, rather than a central leader approach.
Well, just to generally answer the question for everybody's benefit, the idea that you would cut a tree down to 2 feet is generally a no-no in my book. So I guess the short answer is no. If there was damage to it, or if it was a bare root tree, and even with a bare root, I recommend the first year letting it grow. If you want to start training it with limb spreaders, you can. I don't believe people should be pruning. I know they send you home and some people say just cut it down to 2 or 3 feet right away. So my answer is no, don't do it. We actually had a peach tree that we did it to one year, and if you get the timing wrong, all the energy is going to go into the stored energy in the root is going to be what makes that tree grow the first year. And if you cut the top off of it, basically, if it's too past the breaking of the dormancy at all, you're essentially knocking that tree out and it may not grow at all. So for everyone's benefit, I would say, don't bring a tree down to 2 feet.
Okay, well, that's good. Rob Clough, you've got a question. If you can unmute and let Robin have it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I have actually a handful of large figs in like 15-gallon pots, and the roots are, just because they've been there for a while, they've grown into the ground, and just trying to see if it's worth trying to drag them out and trimming them off, or is it, too late? Or
Okay, I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't quite get what the question was.
Is it worth root pruning a fig that's kind of grown into the ground through the pot in a kind of a large down below? And
well, in the case of figs, they're pretty darn hardy. So yeah, I mean, we all have our plant cemeteries where the pots are sitting around and they should have been planted a long time ago, and they grow through the pot. I actually went to a nursery once and complained, and I said, "Are you going to give me a discount on that tree? It's growing through the ground." And the nursery manager, he just yanked on it. He put a knife down and he cut underneath the bottom of the tree, and he said, "It's fine." And I told him I didn't think so. And I could see at the top of the pot, I could see a bunch of girdled roots. And I explained to the fellow that I was intending on taking that tree home, rinsing all the soil off, and showing people how terrible that this tree was. And I was going to use it as a teaching example. And I told him if he gave it to me, I wouldn't tell anybody where I bought the tree from. And he said no, he wouldn't have any of that. So now it's in my garage, and whenever I go in person to give presentations, I carry that tree with me and I show people how terrible it is. And I tell them what nursery I found it from. So in your case, you're the person who's got the tree that's growing through the ground. So my sense is that growing through the ground is the least of your worries. That cutting off the base of that is probably no problem. But my guess is you got a pot full of kinked and bound roots. Now, in the case of figs, you can actually root a fig cutting and get a new tree. So in your case, you have nothing to lose. So get it out of the pot, cut off the bad roots, put the whole thing in the ground if that's what your intention is, or if you just want to clean it up. Yeah, pretty hard to kill a fig. And even if your original pot or your original fig roots don't make it, you've got some cuttings, you can just stick them in the ground and make new fig trees. So go for it.
Thanks.
Okay, Carlos, you have a question. Can you unmute and ask your question of Robin? Okay, if Carlos can't, Carlos is saying, can anything be done to grow branches if they were cut when the tree was young? How do you stimulate new growth?
Well, I would say it depends on how old the tree is now. Yeah, there are some tips. So if you have for instance, maybe you bought a standard tree that was limbed up, and maybe like a citrus tree, which shouldn't be sold that way, but some of them are, or maybe a lemon, and you want to have some lower limbs grow. You kind of look look on the trunk and see if there's any sign of epicormic buds, or even if there's not, sometimes you can actually just wound the bark a little bit. You might force some epicormic growth. I would say a lot depends on the species, but it's sometimes possible to cause, you know, a new limb. And you can also prune a tree just like you can prune a rose bush to try to angle out new growth. So
Right.
I'm not 100% sure I understand, you know, what you're trying to accomplish, but there are
Okay, there's no growth hormones or anything like that that would stimulate growth.
Oh, well, yeah, there are, but that's kind of a whole nother course of study, and
Black magic.
most of that stuff is not available to the public. Yeah, there are things that you can get, although I'm not sure it would accomplish what you're trying to do.
Right. Okay, Kathy says, thank you very much for that information. And it looks like she's been cut out of a, muted too soon. But anyway, all right, I think we've just about come to the questions that I have here. I don't see anybody putting anything more that's relevant to what we were discussing. So thank you very, very much, Robin. You know, everybody gives their thanks, and yeah, man, I learned a lot, and you know, I'll definitely be reviewing this presentation, and I have to show my wife and tell her we've been making some mistakes, and we have to correct things. So I don't know where I'm going to put all the trees that I've got in pots, but
well, and like I say, you know, it's okay to break rules. It's just important to know what the guidelines are if you're going to go against them or go to your own drummer, because then at least you know how to go about correcting something that, you know you're doing something wrong, but there's a right way to do something wrong. I mean, I'm quite into breaking lots of rules, but I do sort of want to know what the science is behind them.
Yeah, well, yeah, we've got some questions come in here, you know, talking about Dave Wilson's nursery and Tom going around to tell everybody that you should whack the tree off at knee height and stuff like that, you know, or plant 3 trees in a hole and all that sort of thing. Yeah, when do these people get educated? And I know they want to sell produce, but you know.
Well, I did try to say that it's not wrong to do that. What I tried to caution people, and quite frankly, I actually was involved with training some master gardeners, and so was Tom. And he came in and had been giving a talk to the master gardener new class, and his talk was about fruit trees, and he got through telling everybody to plant, you know, multiple trees in one hole and multiple grafts and maximizing all the space and how it was great. And I got up next and told people all the terrible things that could happen. And so, you know, people were quite confused by that. And it's very almost unfair to think that it's black and white. And it's not that I'm right or that Tom's right or one of us is wrong. It really is knowing what you're up against if you're going to choose to do, if you want to cut your tree really short, you have to realize once you head a tree back that not only are you creating a wound, but you're going to cause epicormic growth, and it's going to be not the way it should be. So then you have to correct it again and again. And just like you would see a big, large eucalyptus and somebody comes on and heads the whole thing back. And it will never, ever be the same again. And if you head a tree back or top a tree, you're looking at an annual fix for many, many years if it ever gets corrected. So, you know, there's some things like that I would say are never acceptable. You know, heading back a bare root tree, you know, I've certainly done it. I knew that this was what was common practice, and it was actually Tom Del Hotel, who's a pretty noted rare fruit grower who'd lived down here for many years, taught many classes. Some of you may know Tom, and he's a fellow arborist. He was kind of a role model for me getting involved, and me and Steve getting involved with rare fruit growers. And he's probably the person who was the most influential to me to really stop doing that it really wasn't healthy for the tree. And there were other ways to accomplish getting that open vase structure without doing topping, and, you know, using more limb spreaders, trimming roots, trimming branches more carefully. Because if you realize that, particularly today with so many diseases and pests coming our way, that every time you make a cut, you're making a wound and you're weakening your tree, and you're also introducing places for damage by insects and borers and sap running. So there's just so many things you would really rather avoid. And so the less you can prune a tree and still accomplish the goal, the better.
Right, that's good. Charlie just asked one more question. He said, has your jackfruit produced fruit yet?
No, that's, I believe it passed away. Too cold on you. Too
All
cold.
right, and I have one that we touched on earlier about the roots and mycology and how important those two things are. So when you plant a tree and you know, tease out all the roots and cut off the ones that are gnarly and stuff like that, do you put a mycorrhiza around the roots to promote activity?
Well, and I think, again, this is one of those interesting and complicated answers. If you're planting in native soil, which is what you should be with trees, then the short answer is no. You don't need to, because the mycorrhiza will already be in the soil. If you have, for whatever reason, disrupted your native soil lately, like you've tilled it a lot, or you've maybe removed a lawn, and you brought in some extra new soil and it's all been moved around. It hasn't had time to produce more natural mycorrhiza in the soil, or you've blended a lot of stuff. First of all, if you are adding a lot of amendments to your own garden soil in any big amount, and you plan on planting trees, you better do it in a big area or not do it at all. But basically, my sources say that it's unnecessary, that the mycorrhiza is specific to your soil. So actually these products, first of all, there's been some research on the products that sell supposedly with fertilizers with added mycorrhiza inoculants. And some of them have been tested and there's actually nothing in there. Other ones have tested that there is some evidence of some mycorrhiza, but it's not very much. It might be the wrong type for actually doing anything useful. So generally, if you have decent soil, and when I say decent, I don't mean that it's nice and fertile and loamy. What I mean is that it's not terribly disturbed, and it's just been able, if it grows even weeds, it usually is growing something. And so the mycorrhiza will be there, particularly if it's gotten some moisture, I guess, it really comes down to feeding the soil. So the best thing you can do when you plant your tree is you mulch. So the wood chips that you put on top of the soil, not in the planting hole, are going to create the activity that will then become your mycorrhiza that will go into the soil and eventually feed your roots. And so I can't emphasize enough how important those wood chips are, as opposed to putting any sort of amendment or compost in your planting holes.
Yeah. Frank's got a question too. But before we get to you, Frank, talking still about the mycorrhiza, I know I read, maybe it was Chinese article, but when you do air layering, they say that you should pick up some of the soil from around the base of the mother plant and incorporate that into your mixture around the cut on the air layering, so that it's, you know, all part of the same family.
Well, I've never heard that, but that makes a lot of sense to me. In fact, certainly some people have simply actually put soil into that containerized space. In fact, actually, I know we've had, I tried to do some air layering with like sphagnum moss, and it didn't work very well. And Steve used some just quality potting soil, and it seemed to work a lot better. But the idea of taking native soil and using it blended in, that makes very good sense to me, because again, this is kind of what I'm getting at, is that the sooner you can get your plants into native soil, the better off that tree will be. So if you can introduce it while you're air layering it, it's an artificial process anyway.
Yeah.
So it's probably in my, you know, this is not, I'm basing this kind of piecing things together to answer the question, but it makes very good sense to me that that would be a wise thing to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Frank, your question, if you're unmuted.
Yep. Actually, it's Robert.
Oh, Robert,
the other host name. Yeah, I was going to ask, when you're trimming the roots before you plant into the ground, do you have to treat the roots at all? I'd expect that the cuts on the moist soil might be vectors.
You know, I've asked that question myself, because we had a couple of instances with encountering crown gall, and so, you know, it's hard to tell whether that was something that came in on the plant or something that we induced. And I was so concerned that it was caused by me, but basically the science tells me that it's actually in your soil already. And although, again, this is all about being judicious. It's really about the fact that this is, you're not kidding yourself that you're not setting your plant back. And I would use an example here of an avocado, because another tree that I haul around and usually would be showing you all live if we were all sitting together and in a room right now instead of online. But we had a holiday avocado, and it was about 7 years old, and we started noticing that it was getting a lien, Margaret, if you're still listening, and it was getting a bigger lien, and Steve would be out there watering it, and it just seemed to get more and more water and look sadder and sadder. And finally one day, you know, he said, Robin, I think we have to take it out. And I said, well, okay. And so he yanked it up, and we ended up washing all the roots off. And this 7-year-old avocado, which we had planted, and I thought I had done my due diligence about not washing it off at that time, but, you know, really cleaning off the soil enough to think that I could see that the roots were good. And it was a 5-gallon avocado tree. And in 7 years, it had grown up so badly that it had basically girdled itself, and the roots had not spread out. And if you saw it in my garage, it's just a horrible looking thing. And so I guess the answer to this is, what happened after that is that we ended up buying another avocado. We got a surprise avocado, and it was also a 5-gallon from a box store, by the way, which I want to make sure you understand that I'm not touting any particular nursery, and there's some reasons to buy from the box stores, and that is that they buy from the same sources, and they just put their own brand on it, and they sell it a little cheaper. So you really are getting a good quality. Just don't expect to get good information from the big box stores, because they don't necessarily hire people with really good information as a rule. And but anyway, you know, we had that little relatively tender small avocado, and we washed all the soil off. And there were some roots that really were fairly large, you know, on the 5-gallon plant, and we trimmed them off, and we cut some other ones and spread it out and planted it. And for the next 6 months, that poor little tree looked pretty pitiful. In fact, I think both of us thought it might not make it. And all I can say is within the following 6 months, it sprung back, put on all beautiful foliage, and it's doing great now. So, I mean, I think that you have to realize there will be a setback from cutting those roots. But the basic answer is, I don't know what you think you would put on the roots to make them somehow better. But, you know, in terms of adding any chemicals or fertilizers or vitamins or the sort, the answer would be no.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You know, we're getting close to 2 hours. I don't know how you're going. We're still getting a few questions come in. There's one from Liz Strauss. Liz, are you unmuted? Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
All right, then go ahead and ask your question, and we'll make that the last one. Let you get back to your family, Robin.
Okay, thanks. I just was surprised, Robin, when you said that eucalyptus was a good mulch. I live in Oakland, and I was told, no, don't put eucalyptus, that's just going to kill everything. So I just wonder if you could explain that a little better, please.
Yes, I absolutely will. Well, there's two sides to that question. And one is that there are people that think that eucalyptus growing naturally when they're still alive are allelopathic and therefore chemically repress other plants that grow near them. And that's pretty much been debunked by the science. An oak tree has a much more allelopathic presence or a walnut than a eucalyptus. And a lot of research has been done on mulches. And so UC, also Linda Chalker-Scott and Dr. Jim Downer at UC at the UC Extension Service in Ventura County. He's their horticultural advisor up there, and they've collaborated on mulch types and efficacy, and again, using different kinds, different grades of coarseness. And inevitably, the two top mulches, believe it or not, have been eucalyptus and palm shreddings. And partly it's because they last longer, and because they don't break down so fast, they create a little bit more air pockets in between, and that's good for mulch because it allows oxygen and water to penetrate. They also seem to have better ability to do all the good things that all mulches do. So I don't think it's so much that you should go out of your way to get eucalyptus, is that you certainly shouldn't shun it. I actually am expecting a eucalyptus mulch delivery tomorrow morning. So I have arborist friends and they know that we like it. And so when they get a little load, they dump it in our driveway. So I definitely can tell you that there is science behind this. There's research behind this. And if you would like it confirmed, go up and read Linda Chalker-Scott's Horticultural Myth blog. And you can find it at the University of Washington website. And if you look up at the end of my presentation, I have her, I believe, a URL for both the University of Washington and her blog site.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation, and the Q and answers went pretty well. So thank you very much. It's the first time we've adopted this approach to have more participant interaction with the speaker. So thank you very much, everybody. And again, I will review this when it gets up on our website, on our YouTube website, because I've got to tell my wife that what mistakes we've made and see if we can't correct some of them. But again, it was wonderful and just an amazing presentation. I know that you said you could talk for hours on other topics. Maybe you've led yourself into a follow-up at some point in time down the road.
Well, and I
But
would
thanks
remind anybody, if they do want to ask any more questions over time, feel free. Email is the best way to reach me. And if you have specific questions, just, write them down and send me pictures. And usually I will try to answer as possible by email, what I can't run out the door and do. But if it's a reasonable question and it's something I can answer remotely, I'm happy to do that. So.
Well, thank you very much for that offer. Gratefully appreciated. And I think we might conclude tonight's meeting. Thank you to everybody for participating. It was really, really good. And all I can say for everybody, be safe. We're not out of this yet and we've got a long way to go. So just be careful, be respectful, mask up, and keep socially distant.
Stay home in your garden.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Robin. Take care.
Good night, everybody.